Our mission is to ensure that there's equitable access or really unrestricted access to plant-based medicines for anybody on this planet who seeks it.
This is our humble hemp patch.
5,000 years of medical cannabis use.
We're learning about other cannabinoids.
Marijuana is grown in every state in the Union.
I'm Lex Pelger, Director of Education at CV Sciences, and this is the Lex Files. We're lucky to have Carlos Plazola as an ally for plant medicines and other entheogens. He's been a scientist studying the environment, he's spent 10 years working in government, and he ran businesses employing dozens of people. Now he's brought all those skills and his personal story to helping to found the Decriminalized Nature movement in Oakland, California. An organization has become a springboard for similar movements around the globe. Decriminalized Nature wants to decriminalize entheogenic plants, restore a root connection to nature, and improve human health and well-being. Today, Carlos shares about his experiences as a father and the big experience with psilocybin mushrooms that helped him begin this next stage of his journey. In 2019, Decriminalized Nature got plant medicines officially deprioritized by law enforcement in Oakland, California. Rather than rest on their laurels, they created other initiatives, as well as seeding chapters across the country and the world. This is a big deal. This kind of grassroots decriminalization effort is an important counterbalance to the looming corporate actors seeking to commodify the power of psychedelics. Needless to say, Carlos is somebody we can learn from. He tells us what led him here, how he succeeded within the system, and what nature and drugs mean to him. Hello, everybody. I'm very pleased to be here today with Carlos Plazola, the co-founder of Decriminalized Nature Oakland, which became the platform for decriminalized nature all around the world. And so, Carlos, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here, Lex.
And so just as we were talking before we got started, you mentioned about being a parent and how that actually helped fuel decriminalized nature. So what was the story there?
When I became a parent, actually before becoming a parent, I'd gotten my degree in environmental science, and I was training in social justice organizing and doing some work in social justice organizing. And then I found out I was going to be a father, and then again, and then again. And then I spent the next 20 years, really, from the age of 28 to about 48, really just being a provider. So even though I held my idealistic views and I cared about this planet and the social justice causes, much of my time was really around how to raise my children from a place of calmness, and so much of my life was spent getting resources for my family, ensuring they had all the things in life that I didn't have growing up, making sure they had a good, safe environment, that my wife and I provided them good comfort and safety. And then it was interesting and somewhat serendipitous that when I had my transformative mushroom journey in October of 2018, my children were already sort of planning on going to college. Then they were grown up at that point. And then it really raised the question for me about what kind of world am I sending them into? As a parent, we spend so much time giving our children the beautiful life that they deserve, and then they fly out of the nest into the world. And so my vision was turned inward, but also outward, to look at the world as it was that they were going into. And that's when I really recognized that for me, decriminalized nature is a spiritual journey for me, about transforming this planet to be more loving and compassionate for all of those children flying the nest and going into the world. So that's the story I was going to share. So for me, the decrim nature is very it's a passion, but it's also a spiritual journey for me.
Another child, so to speak.
There you go. Yes.
I'm curious because you mentioned elsewhere that you dabbled some with psychedelics in your youth, but that it was that recent mushroom journey that really changed things for you. And I was wondering about that journey and what happened on that trip specifically.
Yeah, and even though I dabbled with, I think LSD was the first and only actual psychedelic I did when I was 17. But at the time, I had probably, a couple of 40 ounces in me, and had smoked enough pot that I was pretty not present. And so I didn't really remember much about the LSD trip other than seeing some really nice visuals. And so then I spent the next 30 years from the age of 17 to about 47 just trying to heal in different ways. And this all flows into my mushroom journey because people are like, well, how could one mushroom journey be so powerful? And it's really because I spent 30 years plus actually trying to heal. And that is, to find my way through the planet in a way that felt right for me. And so I sought healing in, first it was through education. So I thought, okay, I could find because I grew up with a bit of trauma in my childhood. And so I went into science. I got my master's in environmental science. I got my undergraduate degree in biology and anthropology. And so I thought, okay, the answers must lie in education and then science. And then I was very fit. I did a lot of running. I did a lot of weightlifting and try to heal through that. And all the while, when I say I'm trying to heal, really what I'm trying to do is figure out how to become free. And I didn't really understand what that meant at the time until the mushroom journey. But in retrospect, what I was searching when I was searching for my freedom was to disconnect from the things in my life that were causing me to react, the trauma, the painful experiences, the default mode network. And so really when I was going through my education, my science, my fitness, and then eventually yoga and meditation as I got older, I was trying to figure out how to disconnect from that trauma and live a life that was fully from a place of a higher consciousness, aware of the trauma, aware of the everyday sort of constraints that I had, but at least to recognize I was in that state and then choose not to be in that state if I didn't want to be. So that was kind of leading up to the mushroom journey after 30 years of hard work of trying to heal. Then I went into the mushroom journey because I had sort of ran out of tricks, if you will, on shedding myself from the trauma. And this is after my mother passed in 2013. My brother and sister and I had a falling out just because we had been raised in a great deal of struggle, and we weren't able to kind of keep the relationships together. And so I was just left really asking, what is there? What meaning is there when everything from your childhood could just disappear? Everything you held sacred is just gone. And so I got deep into physics, deep into meditation. I started looking for answers through mathematical equations and through meditation. And they both brought me to the same place, which was the void. You go deep enough in physics, you realize it's all just a bunch of nothing. Or math equations and energy. But none of this that we see is actually out there, so to speak. And the same thing in meditation, Zen meditation, you go to that state of the void, and I was left with this empty feeling. So that was this emptiness, right? This sort of lack of anything being real was where I was sitting. And so when I went into the mushroom journey, it was after reading Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, and learning about mushrooms. And so then I went and did a 5-gram journey. I called a friend. I said, hey, can you get some of these mushrooms? And went into a room, locked the door behind me, and went into a journey on my own. And what happened was pretty phenomenal from the kind of inward experience, and then also from just the neural network. Now that I've come to learn what happens with the dendrites and the axons and basically the neurons, and I'm happy to kind of share that story, but that gets you current as to what happened leading up to the mushroom experience.
And for those of you who don't know your scales as well with psilocybin mushrooms, 5 grams is what they call the heroic dose. Terence McKenna's challenge was, if you really want to get to know these, you take 5 grams by yourself in a dark room. And it's a daunting experience for most people who have dabbled in these to contemplate. So kudos to you for being willing to go into the room. And so I'm curious, what did happen on that trip, and then how it inspired you to form Decriminalized Nature, and what vision you saw for what this movement might accomplish?
Lex, I got to give you props. That's the first time anyone has ever asked me that critical question. And it's funny because that is really what my own personal genesis came out of that. No one's ever asked me that, though. Interestingly enough. So the first thing that happened was I felt my body dissolving, and I literally was looking in the mirror and seeing myself dissolve and sort of fade away. The self, the ego connection to my physical body. And then from there, I started to sort of my consciousness, my visuals became infinite, cosmic. I was looking out into infinite and having a conversation with what felt like an infinite being. And to this day, I've asked people, what was that? Because it was the voice I was talking to, the entity that I was talking to was so much more profoundly wise than I was. And I was asking it questions and it was giving me answers. And even if I didn't ask a question, it was giving me guidance. All the while, I'm looking out into the infinite and seeing the creation of life, of existence. And in that moment, what it said is, life really is. So love, that feeling of love, is the reverence for life, and life is simply awareness. It's the opposite of being unaware, right? So here we come into this plane of existence, and in the infinite sense, all of us originating from the source came forth through just awareness. And it showed me what that looked like. The best way I could describe it is fractals, where the universe that we live in is some tiny speck in an infinite set of fractals that go out into nothingness. And that feeling of fear that we have, that fear of death that we have, is simply life pushing into the darkness. And the death for us represents non-existence, right? The lack of awareness, or the ceasing of awareness. But really what life is about is just being, and being from a place of love. And the depth of love that I felt in that journey was tremendous, as you often hear from people, their experiences, or you hear about near-death experiences, just that deep feeling of connected to the infinite source of love. And it was like, this is it. This is what there is. And to live is simply to do your best to live from that place of love, not from a state of fear. And because fear collapses love, it senesces love, and it senesces life. And so it said, be beauty, which is the expression of love, not fear. So be beauty, no fear was the message. It also taught me and told me that I've been addicted to fear my entire life since I saw I went through, experienced a lot of violence as a young person, that since then I had become addicted to fear. And many of the activities I was engaging in, and many people who come from trauma do this, they simply live a life to subdue the fear. And the message was just let it go. And it showed me really what beauty looked like. The creation, the act of creation is life. So it showed me all of this, and it was a long conversation, and there was a lot to it. And then as I came out of it, the message was very clear: just be love, act from love, and be beauty. So I said, okay. So then in my sort of unwinding process, I said, let me really just integrate this. And so as I was coming down, I was sort of taking notes on my iPhone about the messages I had received. And then the next day, I just started Googling what happened. What was this? In essence, what it did is it connected all the things I'd been searching for all of my life with all of the spiritually, with all the data I had been gathering in my journey here on this planet. And it sort of brought them all together. And then that's when the image of the famous psilocybin, what it does to your brain image, where it shows one brain without psilocybin, and then another brain with psilocybin, and how all the different areas of the brain start talking to each other in hyperdrive. The next month then was just a series of constant epiphanies. It was almost 30 days of continuous epiphanies, one after the other, just tying loose ends that I'd been trying to tie my entire life. In that time, I also found this really beautiful underground psychedelic community in the Bay Area that I started to integrate into and learn from. and was basically devouring anything I could read, scientific research papers, the best of which for me was the one that was published by UC Davis in May of 2019 that was specifically about neuroplasticity. And that really showed me what happened in that moment when I was experiencing all these connections.
Wow. That is a beautiful trip. And I've gathered a lot of trip stories in my day, and that's a really lovely one, especially because it seems like when people come to it with awareness and preparation is when you really get the most out of it. And it seems like your 30 years really paid off for those crazy 30 days.
And it was all, yeah, for sure. And it was also for 2 years, I'd been meditating pretty much daily for 2 hours, seeking meaning. And again, trying to figure out what happened to my mother when she died. What is this life about? Does it actually have meaning? And I had gotten to the void, which was the conclusion. I didn't really feel anything anymore any day because it was all nothing. And that was the state that I went in with. So I didn't have any preconceived notions about what I would experience. I wasn't searching for any particular thing. I just went in as a blank slate and said, show me what you got to show me. And that was what emerged.
That's wonderful. Yeah, they often say the mushroom gives what you need, not what you ask for. So often not asking for anything goes really well.
Then after that, there was 3 or 4 other, I've had since then, I think 4 other powerful journeys that have sort of filled in the gap, so to speak, from that initial one. But the initial one was certainly the big launch.
And so I often hear stories of people having these really great experiences of love and then not being able to integrate them or really bring them out to the world. But it sounds like yours came up with something very practical. So how did this lead to decriminalize nature?
Yeah, well, I would say that it was finding the community that was doing the work was critical, because had I not found the community, I don't know how it would have manifested. But walking in and, first of all, let me just say, it felt very divine for me. Like I would meet someone and then something would emerge from there that felt very larger than the moment. And I could feel it in the moment. And really all I was doing was saying yes without any fear. I was really just listening to the message, be beauty, no fear. And so I would connect with someone and they would say, oh, I want to introduce you to someone else. And I want to introduce you to this community. And then we'd go and we'd meet. And actually the genesis of Decrim Nature was we all had a meeting together because I had a space that I was trying to make available for people who did healing work, a building. And we gathered about 12 of us and we just went around and introduced ourselves. And as I introduced myself, I said, I used to work in government. I know how to pass resolutions and legislation if anybody wants to do something. And then someone else said, hey, why don't we do something in Oakland on psychedelics? That's why we were there, to talk about psychedelics and particularly plant medicines. And then it just sort of rolled from there. So really, it felt as if I was suddenly just connected to a larger force that was acting on all of us. And my job was just to say yes. And frankly, it's felt that way ever since. So I'm not sure how much of it is really me forcing it versus just saying yes to the right things. And most importantly, having the courage to say yes, which I think is sometimes where folks get stuck, is you're in a career, maybe you're ambitious and you want to own a big house, or you want to go on big trips or whatever. And so you don't want to risk that for what you're being asked to do as part of your journey. And so you say no. And then in that moment, you've sort of closed off the path that perhaps you would have or should have been on. In my case, I'd already raised a family. I had seen the darkness that the world had to offer. I wasn't particularly afraid of anything anymore. I felt before the journey very dead inside. So I didn't really have much to lose in saying yes. People say, oh, you're very courageous for speaking publicly as a business person about psychedelics. There really wasn't courage involved. I was just grateful to be alive again.
And it's been working. It sounds like you tapped into something at the right time. We released a product so good that it made my wife say, oh, that's really good. I know. I wouldn't have believed it either if I hadn't seen it. But she's right. And she knows her stuff on health and supplements. Our CV Defense is a daily supplement for supporting the immune system. It includes zinc, selenium, vitamin A, vitamin D, which apparently 50% of us are deficient in, a blend of reishi mushrooms, often called the mushrooms of immortality, and, for the big endocannabinoid boost, a molecule called PEA. PEA is actually produced by almost every cell of your body and brain. It's one of the best studied components of your endocannabinoid system, and it's been the focus of a large number of clinical trials and basic research. It's a fascinating molecule that seems to help out in all kinds of ways, including by balancing your immune system. PEA is being hailed as the next great ingredient for boosting our endocannabinoid system, and that's because it works, and it's incredibly safe. So, with PEA, that mix of vitamins and mushrooms, CV Defense is a daily immune system boost for you. Use a coupon code LEXFILES at cvsciences.com for 25% off your bottle of CV Defense. See why my wife is impressed. So I was wondering if you could give us an update on what's happened so far in Oakland with the resolutions and the work of Decriminalized Nature.
Yeah, so in June of 2019, we passed the Decriminalized Nature resolution, which made lowest priority of enforcement and defunded police enforcement of entheogenic plants and fungi. And so now all that means, what that means, not all that means, because it's actually significant, is that people can enjoy their own personal relationship with entheogenic plants and fungi as you would enjoy your relationship with tomatoes, oranges, lemons, basil. So you can grow them, you can share them, you can have a party with them, with your friends, family, whatever. And the only thing you can't do is the same thing you can't do with your tomatoes or your oranges. You can't go out and sell them. If you do that, you fall into a whole different framework, and it becomes it's not legal. It's not decriminalized here locally to sell or to cultivate for commercial, but it is for personal, and that's just here local. So our local police department and our local prosecutors will not prosecute for entheogenic plants or fungi if it's for personal use. So that's been since June of 2019. After that, we had a number of cities reach out to us who wanted our support. And since then, we've grown to over 100 cities having their own decriminalized nature chapter, or at least beginnings of formation. I think right now we probably have 40 different chapters in the U.S. and 6 countries, Canada, Mexico, Chile, and Colombia, I believe recently Germany and Ireland. So that's been since June 2019. In July of 2020, we proposed with our council sponsor, Noel Gallo, to pass an ordinance, which is, I believe, to be perhaps about as revolutionary as you can get in shifting the health and wellness practices, particularly consciousness wellness practices in the Western world. That's a bold statement, but I will say it. What we're doing is we're taking what has really been traditional ancient ceremony, which is a community container of ceremony, and we are making a deal with the city of Oakland that if it will legally protect us through the use of its city attorney's resources against prosecution, then we agree to safe practices that are proposed by the facilitating community. Those who are involved in underground facilitation, who know how to do this work very safely, many of whom have been trained by ancient tradition practitioners, indigenous folks from throughout the world. And so taking those lessons of how to do safe practice, we've created a set of safe practice guidelines. We've presented them to the city. We said in exchange for us agreeing to these, you protect us legally with your city attorney's office. And so we proposed that. It's coming in November, December for a vote. And if we pass that, then it becomes a model for other cities to begin to implement and support community-based ceremony, bottom-up community-based ceremony, particularly accessible to the most vulnerable, which is really where we're trying to target our work. And then recently, with the help of Dr. Bronner's company, particularly David Bronner's leadership, he has, with us, retained services of a lobbying firm to pass this statewide through a pilot project, statewide legislative effort, which means any city in California could then pass their own local ordinance and opt into the state protection. So this would mean that if you're practicing in ceremony using safe practices, you would then be able to get your own city attorney's protection and then the state of California's protection. We think this is a good path towards removing these plant allies from Schedule 1, because we're also going to sit with our Attorney General's office, tell them what we're doing, and ask for their at least unofficial support until these plants are descheduled.
That is a wonderful set of things to happen. And for everyone listening, if you want to support entheogenic practices, buy Dr. Bronner's soap, for sure. He's been amazing for many years on this stuff. So the one question I wanted to ask, I have to ask, is what's it like talking to these officials about it? You know, the ones that are pro and also the ones that you're just coming out of left field to them. What's the response been and interacting with government officials on these issues?
And this is where I think that my background was helpful in creating a different narrative in this space. So because I was, for 10 years, I was in politics. I was a congressional aide, and then I was a chief of staff to the council president here in the city of Oakland while Jerry Brown was mayor. And so I met a lot of folks. I understood a lot of political nuances. I ran campaigns. So I understand the political world. And then I went into business for 15 years, ran companies, had dozens of employees. I was well grounded in a place where people knew me as a business person or someone who was savvy in politics. So for me to then step into a room with a politician and say, here's the benefits of plant medicine, they would listen to me not as kind of a hippie psychonaut, but really as a regular person who found deep healing. So when we walked in to meet with council members or politicians, our strategy was always the same: lead with the science, because the science is undeniable. And we're not just talking Western science; we're talking about ancient tradition science and technologies. With the ancient ayahuasca tradition, mushroom traditions, ibogaine and iboga traditions, and mescaline plant traditions. That we would share all of both the new science and the ancient ways of doing it. But then right after that, we would follow up with personal testimonies, because it's one thing to talk science and people kind of absorb that cognitively. But then when you speak from the heart about your own healing process, there's a different reception that people have. They hear it from the heart. And so that was our strategy going in. It's always been our strategy, and it works because it's hard to argue with a personal testimony, particularly if you're sitting talking to an African-American politician with folks from the African-American community, or a Latino politician from Latino community, testimonials from Latino community. They'll hear it more from the heart than the science, although the science kind of opens them up. And so it's been actually much easier than people would think. The hardest part is walking through the door, but once you have the conversation and you lead with the science, it becomes very transformative very quickly for elected officials.
I was wondering if you had other advice for organizations who might want to do something like what you're doing now, about ways that it makes it easier for them and how they would reach out if this sparked an interest in doing it in their community.
And so there's, I'd like to give a sort of framework of how I've come to understand the various organizations doing work in this space. There is a big movement, as you all know, Decriminalized Nature movement. And the goals of Decriminalized Nature movement are really to open things up from the bottom up. In cannabis, what we've seen initially, there was a lot of effort and very sincere effort for medicinal cannabis to heal the most vulnerable, including veterans. This is in the 80s and 90s. And there were great warriors in this space pushing that. But we made a few mistakes when we transitioned the conversation away from medical into taxation and profits. We sort of sold the soul of cannabis. And what's happened since is venture capital has moved in and firmly staked their claim on cannabis. And now we're dealing with the consequences of that. So the Decrim Nature movement is learning from that and saying, first and foremost, we really have to stake out a global position for humans to have access to these plant medicines, a direct relationship with them without any kind of limits in terms of number, amount of plant use they can use. We have to look at issues of sustainability, both in terms of the use of the plants. How do we harvest and how do we grow them sustainably so that we're not basically killing our allies, making them extinct, but then also our sustainable relationships with the ancient teachers of these. So that's our step one, is to decriminalize and make accessible for everyone, so that if you're unhoused, you're highly impoverished in terms of financial access, that you still can get access to these plants some way or another. So that's step one. Once we do that, and we've established that kind of accessibility for everybody, then at that point, our position is, at that point, now you can kind of open the floodgates to clinical, medical, corporate, pharma, because at least you've protected equitable access for people. And so the Decrim Nature movement is about that. And if you want to join us, go to decriminalizenature.org. We actually just released an organizer's handbook. So if you want to start a chapter in your own city, you can. And we'll help you. We'll support you. We'll guide you through the process. Again, for us, it's a spiritual journey to change our relationship with these healing plants. We think it'll save our relationship with the planet long term as well. And then if you wanted to do something that, like they're doing in Oregon on the Psy 2020, then you'd probably do that through an initiative, which means you'd want to raise some money and get an initiative on the ballot. What we suggest to people, encourage people to do, is if you want to do that in your own state or in your own city, also include decriminalization language so you don't create a disparity of access. By decriminalizing for everybody, you can ensure everybody has access, and people have access to clinical or medical models as well.
And could you explain the Psy 2020 to people?
Sure. The Psy 2020 is an initiative in Oregon that has a more of a therapeutic clinical approach. So folks who are looking for psilocybin mushroom experiences specifically to heal trauma can go see a therapist who is sanctioned by the state of Oregon for use of psilocybin mushrooms in a clinical setting. And so it's a very controlled environment, meaning that the cultivation and the manufacturing, fabrication, production of the psilocybin medicine, so to speak, would be in a controlled environment, and then the clinic would be in a controlled environment, which many people prefer, right? So we have a large population in the U.S. who prefers the clinical route, and so we support that, but we just want to make sure that it doesn't come at the expense of equitable access to the rest of populations. And to speak on that a moment, because I think there's a nuance here people don't understand if they haven't been in politics a long time. When you create a special class of permits, that is, let's say you created a set of dispensaries in the city of Oakland, and let's say you have 20 permitted dispensaries paying taxes, and then you have a church that emerges that isn't paying taxes or that doesn't have a permit. What we inevitably see is the dispensaries will organize against the church to get it shut down, because they don't want their special permit to be infringed upon with greater abundance of access. And so we see that constantly whenever we create a special permit of any kind. Inevitably, they organize against increased abundance. And so that's the kind of thing we have to be careful of as a society.
That's a great point. And I'm glad you mentioned that, and previously cannabis, because you've worked in cannabis quite a bit. And you wrote an excellent op-ed in Marijuana Moment about how the commodification of cannabis informs what's happening in plant medicines now. And we'll link to that in the episode notes. But I thought it was a really great point about how if you're paying attention to what's happening with big weed, it could be what's going to be happening to big psychedelics. And the work of Decrim Nature could help keep it more equitable and fair.
And that's fundamentally why we're here, right? At the end of the day, it's our mission is to ensure that there's equitable access, or really unrestricted access, to plant-based medicines for anybody on this planet who seeks it through a direct relationship with it. The healing of one's own consciousness starts first with their understanding that they have agency over their consciousness. And interestingly, that's something that most people at the deepest level, particularly people with deep trauma or people who come from poverty or struggle, don't understand. And so they live in this default mode network reacting to the world around them. And so that understanding that, wow, I can write my own narrative in this world. I choose whether I interpret something as to be afraid of or to embrace and see the beauty of. And that's all the narrative that emerges out of self-agency. And that's what we're trying to protect, to ensure that we never, ever lose the opportunity for every human being to have access to healing. Again, that said, we recognize that if 7.6 billion people on planet Earth started using plant medicines tomorrow, there would be a big danger of extinction for the plant medicine. So recently we created a sustainability committee, and we're looking at how to encourage people to grow their own and how to support a grow your own movement so that we're not depleting natural reserves.
That's good. I've heard of your model described as grow, gather, and gift as opposed to commodification.
That's right. Yeah. And grow, gather, gift. And then we added share. So, you can all sit together and share together in ceremony if that's the other choice. But yeah, that's pretty much it. The decriminalized nature resolution is a grow, gather, gift, share model. No commodification in there. Our current ordinance does have the creation of a task force. That is because we're not naive to how the world works. Many of us come from business. Actually, some of our leaders run their own large corporations and build corporations. And we recognize that in order to supply the world, you have to have those who create, manufacture, and distribute, and those who use, because they're not always the same, and nobody's going to always grow their own. So our current ordinance has a task force created that is a micro enterprise creation task force. And the intention of that task force is to ask the simple question: how can we create models of value creation where the value stays in communities? These are business models or production models, distribution models, but where the value creation stays in community, not where we commodify the plants and fungi, but where we can commodify the services that are being provided. And that includes perhaps cultivation and ceremony, but where the value of that isn't getting sucked out into venture capital corporations and going to Canada, Mexico, New York, or other large cities, but is staying actually in the communities where the ceremony is happening. And so that's what we want to explore with our community, and invite leaders from throughout the U.S. who are thinking about these things, like Bennett Zellner and other folks in Denver who are actually doing a lot of work around co-ops and ESOPs, and how do we do those kinds of models here in Oakland.
Are there other organizations or movements that help to inspire yours, or that you take some of the thinking from? For me personally, I've learned a lot from the environmental justice movement and how it related to the environmental movement. That's been a big learning curve for me as I stepped into this space as a person of color, immigrant background. My parents were immigrants, and stepped into this with all of the history of a person of color and an immigrant in the United States. I stepped into this in what was pretty much a mainstream white psychedelic community. And it was very much like the environmental justice and environmental movement, where back in the 80s and 90s, the environmental justice movement had very different priorities, the environmental movement. And back then, leaders like Richard Moore and some others whose names escape me at this point, went to the Audubon Society, went to Sierra Club, and said, look, we have to start really ensuring that the toxic dumping in our communities is just as important as saving birds. Not that saving birds isn't important, but saving our children from toxic contamination is equally important. And they were rebuffed by the environmental movement at the time, and said, but that's not the environmental movement, that is social justice. And so for us, there's a lot of similarities here. What we're talking about with psychedelics is ensuring that every consciousness
has access to healing, including the most vulnerable in our community, because they're us. And we created them collectively. They didn't choose to be unhoused or to be incredibly impoverished or even addicted. We've created that through our society, and it's our obligation collectively to figure out how we can serve the most vulnerable. And I think that currently has not been the highest priority of the psychedelic movement. It's really been more like the environmental movement of the 80s and 90s. It's been about how do we build good science, and but those who can afford it are typically not the most vulnerable.
That's a great point. And one thing I'll just mention is you just got a fan out of in my father. You mentioned Richard Rohr, and he's on your team. So if anyone doesn't know Richard Rohr, he's an amazing spiritual thinker. So yeah, that one's for you, Dad.
Right on.
One of the last things I wanted to ask about, when you refer to plant medicines or entheogens and the complications of language around, what's included, what's not included in all of this, usually it seems like all of us, including your organization, is talking about the big four: mushrooms containing psilocybin, iboga, ayahuasca, and cacti containing mescaline. Is it a challenge to focus on certain plants that are widely recognized while you know about other plants that also have entheogenic uses? And how do you draw that line on where to focus your energies?
Well, we chose with great intention to focus our energies on nature, and not really, because as humans we like to break things down into bite-sized categories, but we really felt it was important to make this about our relationship with nature, because the truth is we got over 1,000 plants that create DMT. We got a number of plants that create 5-MeO-DMT. We have a number of plants that create ibogaine compounds. And so we wanted to make it about all of those. So we actually chose a category of compound plants that had certain compounds in them that were on Schedule 1. And it just very conveniently happened to be all the plants that were on Schedule 1, as opposed to coca and poppy that are on Schedule 2 as plants. And so that's the path we chose. And it actually has been a pretty convenient delineation, because it's basically everything that's produced by nature that has these particular compounds in them that affect our consciousness in ways that open us up to receiving new information or assembling information in new ways.
And can you tell us about what brought about the statement on your site recently about a call for unity on peyote? I know that can be a tricky subject.
Yeah, for us, it's not all that complicated, and it gets back to the sustainability issue. Thinking about this globally, now taking a step way back, and sort of you're sitting looking at this beautiful planet from space, and you see all these beautiful humans living on them, and sometimes they have acts that come from trauma, so they can be a little destructive sometimes. But taking humans together and their relationship with the biosphere and the plants of the biosphere and the fungi, which predate the plants on the biosphere, and looking at our relationship, what we recognize as decrim nature is that at the highest level, it's really about how do we get humans to recognize their role? How can we help humans recognize their role as part of this biosphere, humble parts of this biosphere? And the plant allies are really there to teach us that. And are they bringing messages from the biosphere, or is it just us already knowing it when we go into our deepest subconscious? I don't know. But the messages are clearly, what we hear a lot is we have to improve our relationship with each other and this planet. And those messages come from peyote, and they come from ayahuasca, and they come from DMT, and they come from huachuma, San Pedro, and all these other plants. So at the highest level, that's what we understand. However, at the next level down, we have these cultures, ancient cultures that have been working with these plants for centuries. In the case of the Native American Church, for a couple of centuries. In the case of the Wixárika, which are in Mexico, for several thousand years. And then there's some groups along the border that have also been working with them for several thousand years. Our sponsor, Noel Gallo, comes from the Yaqui tradition. His grandmother was Yaqui, and so their history with peyote dates back thousands of years, I believe, if I'm getting my history correct. But then San Pedro at the southern part of the U.S. border, because in the United States, Native American Church, the peyote was introduced only a couple hundred years ago. So we want to honor all the different cultures of the world. However, some cultures are more deeply, more recently emerging from the trauma of colonialism. In the United States, obviously one of the greatest oppressors with colonialism has affected the Native American community in a very deep way. So we recognize that, we honor where they're coming from. But at the same time, everybody needs to get the message if we're going to save our planet. And so we want to figure out ways where we can unite around saving peyote, where not just one group is saving peyote, but where everybody can participate in saving peyote, in saving ayahuasca, and saving and preserving. And what we know through conservation biology, which was kind of a sub-major for myself at Yale, is that you get best conservation and preservation results when people are informed and aware about the problems and can participate in the solutions as a global community. And so our suggestion is that we move beyond secrecy and beyond control, and we enable all of us to become stewards of sacred plants on this planet, recognizing, and here's where we kind of get back to the respect of ancient tradition, recognizing that there are some traditions in this world that have had very long relationships with plants, and we need to honor those because they have a lot to teach us. And in the Western world, we sort of disregard that for reductionist scientism. But that's what's kind of gotten us in this mess. So we need to get beyond that and say, how can we learn from the Wixárika? How can we learn from the Native American Church? How can we learn from the traditions in West Africa using ibogaine and iboga, and then really see them as our teachers, and also honor the relationship they have. So that's where we're coming from, and we honor all traditions.
The last question I wanted to ask is something you've touched on a good bit already, but I wanted it to be the final word. How does social justice and the war on drugs play into your work and the vision of decriminalized nature? Oh, brother, my favorite question. Thank you. So I'm going to go very personal here. In my own family, I have, so my history is that my grandmother, and I draw from my own stories because this is a very personal journey for me. And oftentimes your own personal stories can really share what's in your heart more than facts and data. My grandmother was an indigenous woman in El Limón, Jalisco, a very small town in the middle of Jalisco. And she lived in a mud hut on the outskirts of town with a thatch roof, 8 by 10 foot hut. She raised my father. His father left, soon before he was born. So she raised him as a very impoverished woman who, washed people's clothes in the river. On the other side of my family, my grandfather was indigenous from Chihuahua. We don't know much about his ancestry. But what emerged there based on their poverty and struggle was a lot of violence, alcoholism, violence, domestic abuse, and it affected my family over generations. And so in my own family, I have family members that have been incarcerated for drug use. I have family members who've died young as a result of drug use, alcoholism. So the question of the war on drugs is personal for us as a family. We've been affected by it very deeply. But what I tell people is that if 20% of my family or my cousins, or 10% of my family or my cousins, or some percentage of my cousins were affected by the war on drugs, all of us were affected by the war on our consciousness. And meaning that we all are stuck in trauma and default mode network, and we all have the ability and we all have the opportunity, hopefully, to heal the deep wounds of our intergenerational trauma as well as our own life trauma. That's where the entheogens are really important, because yes, to liberating people out of prison in their physical incarceration, but so many of us, especially people who come from communities of trauma, are incarcerated in their own minds. And I don't think that people who've not been raised in trauma really understand the depths of which people struggle in their own personal incarceration of their consciousness. That's where the Decrim Nature movement comes into play. We want to partner with Drug Policy Alliance. We want to partner with Ella Baker Center and other organizations that are fighting incarceration of people physically, because our struggles are the same. It's about liberation of all people. Well said. Carlos Plazola, thank you so much for your work and for coming on to the show to let us know more about it. It was very informative.
Thank you. Appreciated it.
Until next time. Thanks for tuning in. To listen to other episodes, find us at pluscbdoil.com or on YouTube or on all the podcast platforms. Subscribe to the CV Sciences YouTube channel to see each new episode. And if you'd like to buy any of our fine products, use the coupon code Lex Files for 25% off. If you have any questions, compliments, or suggestions, feel free to write me at research@cvsciences.com or follow the podcast on Twitter at The Lex Files Show. If you enjoyed this program, please rate us on iTunes or share a link to your social media. It means a lot to us. The Lex Files is produced by Matt Payne. Our chief advisor is Amabel Dela Cruz. The music is by Jake Bradford Sharp. The YouTube videos are by Brendan Cleek. And our sponsor is CV Sciences, makers of America's favorite CBD oil. Remember the coupon code LEXFILES. And I'm Lex Pelger, signing off.